Welcome everybody to the Community Housing Workshop. It is co-hosted by many orgs, including Chicago Volunteer Legal Services, Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, Chinese American Service League, Coalition for Better Chinese American Community, Bridgeport Alliance, and the 11th Ward IPO. We will have breakout rooms later in the presentation according to languages. And also, if you speak English, we will have separate breakout rooms for tenants, landlords, and homeowners. Our main presentation will be in English, but our slides will have Chinese and Spanish translation. And I have Andrea and Sam helping translate during the main workshop. So thank you for that. And so I'll pass it over to Marty Cazzola from Chicago Volunteer Legal Services to get us started.
Thank you very much. My name is Marty Cazzola. I'm an attorney at Chicago Volunteer Legal Services. We primarily assist small landlords right now, but I'm going to present these slides for both landlords and tenants. That's not printed here, so I'll pause so that can be translated, and then I'll get into full English.
大家好，我们现在的培训就开始了。我们现在就要进入新冠疫情期间的给大家科普一下驱逐令的辩护。然后之后我们现在是 Marty 来自 CVLS 的 Marty 会为大家进行这个讲座。之后我们会按照不同的语言和不同的角色，比如说租客、房东、房主，来把大家分成不同的breakout room。
Buenas tardes, vamos a comenzar con el señor Martín para que pueda él explicar la presentación sobre los propietarios de hogar y los rendeteros. Igualmente, Martín es de la organización CPLS y va a estar dando esta presentación en inglés, pero están las traducciones en chino y en español en la presentación.
All right, next slide. So the ground rules for tonight are that this is a general information only session. For specific information about your situation, please consult an attorney. Contact information for attorneys will be provided. In addition, local rules can change. We will be talking mostly about the rules here in the city of Chicago. Next slide. Every eviction case has 5 steps. A landlord cannot evict a tenant unless the landlord follows all 5 steps. Next slide. First step is proper notice, then there is filing and service, then the initial court dates, then the eviction trial, then enforcement of the eviction order. We will talk about the eviction process and changes to this process caused by COVID-19 in that order. Next slide. When providing a notice, the landlord must serve other notices in a blank declaration form. Next slide. There are different types of notice. A 5-day notice is used for unpaid rent. A 10-day notice is used for other causes or lease violations. In suburban Cook County, a 60-day notice for non-renewal of a lease. In the city of Chicago, the length of the non-renewal notice depends on how long the tenant has lived in the property, between 30 and 120 days of notice. Next slide. Chicago has its own COVID-19 protection ordinance. In Chicago, the landlord must serve the tenant with a notice about the Chicago COVID-19 ordinance. If the tenant tells their landlord that the tenant has financial impacts due to COVID, then the landlord must try to work out a settlement with the tenant. The landlord must accept rental assistance as part of this settlement. Next slide. Nothing currently prevents a landlord from filing an eviction case after serving a valid notice. However, a landlord who has applied to the Illinois rental payment program has agreed not to file a case. Next slide. Many landlords might be asking, are there alternatives to filing an eviction case? Next slide. Right now, there are two main alternatives. The first is to work towards settlement with their tenant using a third-party mediator from an organization like the Center for Conflict Resolution. Settlement can involve repayment plans, rental assistance, figuring out an agreed move-out date, or changing the rental agreement. Next slide. The other alternative to filing for rental or filing for eviction, and the most important thing that you can do to prevent eviction, is to get rental assistance. Next slide. The place to try to get rental assistance right now is through the Illinois Department of Human Services. Rental assistance is available without regard to immigration or citizenship status. IDHS will provide rental assistance to people with housing subsidies, and you should apply even if you have been denied in previous programs. Rules have changed. Landlords can reach out and encourage their tenants to apply, and there is no cap on the amount that can be paid on past due rent and utilities through the IDHS program. Next slide. Declarations. The landlord must still give their tenant a form declaration before filing an eviction case, but the tenant does not need to wait for the landlord to give them a form declaration. The tenant can create the form on their own and give it to their landlord. Earlier, the declaration prevented, we go back a slide. Earlier, the declaration prevented landlords from filing an eviction, but now the landlord can file a case. The declaration still gives tenants protections later in the eviction process. Next slide, please. Tenants can go to rentervention.com to create a declaration form in either English or Spanish. Next slide, please. Landlords have many new filing requirements. One of these requirements is that landlords must attach a copy of the eviction notice or the demand upon which the eviction case is based, or an affidavit and the lease or parts of the lease. Sorry. Can we go back one more slide? Thank you. Landlords must attach a copy of the eviction notice or demand upon which the action is based, or an affidavit about the lease or parts of the lease if the case is based on a lease violation. Next slide, please. A landlord may continue its eviction case against anyone, including a covered person, if the landlord proves in court that the tenant presents a health and safety risk. Next slide. Eviction cases are now heard via Zoom, just like this Know Your Rights session. Next slide. Zoom information is usually contained on the eviction summons. The clerk of the court, circuit court, and chief judge also have Zoom information on their websites. People can access Zoom court via their phone. If someone cannot access Zoom, they can go to a large common area in the courthouse that's listed on the summons, and court personnel will help parties get on Zoom. Next slide. If a landlord or a tenant does not have an attorney with them or representing them, they should ask to speak with an ERP attorney when they get to court. An ERP attorney is free and can give advice about eviction cases, help negotiate an agreement between the tenant and the landlord, or give advice about rental assistance. Next slide, please. If a tenant has given their landlord a declaration form, the court cannot hold an eviction trial before September 18th, 2021. A judge can still hold some basic or clerical court dates, but not an actual trial. A judge can enter an eviction order if the tenant does not go to court, so tenants need to go to court. Next slide, please. If a landlord believes the declaration is untrue, the landlord can ask the judge to hold a hearing where the landlord and tenant provide testimony. Tenants who can pay some rent should try to pay. Next slide, please. Tenants in Cook County, but not in the rest of the state and not in Evanston or Mount Prospect, have the right to pay what is owed in the court case plus court costs after the case has been filed, but before the judge enters an eviction order. If that happens, the judge must dismiss the eviction case. Next slide, please. Governor Pritzker's eviction moratorium prevents enforcement of eviction orders against people who have given declarations to their landlord before September 18th, 2021. And he has indicated that he will extend this to October 3rd, 2021. Next slide, please. The federal or CDC moratorium you may have heard about has not applied in Illinois, so the US Supreme Court decision a few weeks ago does not affect us here. Next slide. The final stage of an eviction case is enforcement by the sheriff, and sheriffs are currently enforcing eviction orders that were entered before March 13th of 2020. Orders that are against people who do not fill out declarations and give them to their landlord, and also for health and safety violations. Next slide, please. If a landlord skips any of the 5 steps that we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, it is an illegal eviction. Only a sheriff's deputy can execute an eviction order. Even with a valid order in hand, a landlord cannot change the locks on the property until the sheriff's deputy arrives. If a landlord changes the locks, a tenant should call the police. Next slide, please. Tenants, landlords, and homeowners can speak with an attorney for free through the Cook County Legal Aid for Housing and Debt Program. You do not need to wait until an eviction case is filed in order to get services through this program, sometimes called the Early Resolution Program, or ERP. CLAD attorneys can help landlords prepare court documents so that all the rules are followed. And that website at the top, cookcountylegalaid.org, and that phone number, 855-956-5763, are the easiest ways to get access to services through CLAD. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Matthew Holstein. I'm a staff attorney at Chicago Volunteer Legal Services, and I'm going to be talking about some mortgage relief that's available to homeowners. Next slide. So the first big question to ask is whether you have what's called a federally backed mortgage. Next slide. So a federally backed mortgage is one that is owned or insured by one of the following agencies, organizations: Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the FHA, which also includes reverse mortgages, HUD-insured reverse mortgages, or the VA. Next slide. So CVLS has a website to help you find out if you do have a federally backed mortgage. And I'm also going to post that here in the chat. And you can go there, type in your zip code, and go through the steps to find if you have a federally backed mortgage, and then also request some relief there. Next slide. So if you do have a federally backed mortgage, you have the right to put your loan into a COVID-19 forbearance. A forbearance means pausing your loan payments for now. The payments are not forgiven, and they will have to be paid back at a later time. Next slide. So how do you request a forbearance? Next slide. You only need to be affected by COVID-19. You can get a forbearance and pause your mortgage payments, even if your loan was already in default before COVID, and even if your loan is already in foreclosure. Next slide. You can make this request over the phone, but we do recommend it's in writing so you have a record of the request. Your bank cannot demand that you prove that you've been affected. There are no documents you need to submit, no application. And if you want help in submitting a request for forbearance, you can again go to our website and there's a self-help feature there. We also have an email and a hotline that you can call. Next slide. So how long do you have this ability to request a forbearance? If you have a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac loan, it's an open invitation to do this. For the FHA, the deadline is going to close on September 30. Once you're in forbearance and your mortgage payments are paused, how long can you stay in forbearance? How long will the forbearance last? Next slide. It depends. For Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, it really depends when you went into forbearance, but generally the total length of your forbearance would either be 18 months if you were in forbearance before in February or earlier. If you ask for a forbearance today, your forbearance could last as long as a year when you don't have to make mortgage payments. For the FHA, it could be anywhere between 6, 12, or 18 months. If you ask for a forbearance before June, it could be 12 or 18. If you ask for a forbearance today, it will be 6 months. Next slide. And next slide. So what if you are already in forbearance, but you exited forbearance before you were ready? You can go back onto forbearance. You just need to ask your bank. Next slide. So like I mentioned, a forbearance doesn't get rid of mortgage payments. You still have to pay those mortgage payments back later. So what happens when your forbearance ends and you have to make the payments? Next slide. Again, if you have a federally backed mortgage, then regulations are going to require the lender to work with you for an arrangement for those payments when the forbearance ends. If it's not federally backed, you have a private mortgage, then it may be up to your lender what happens. Next slide. So we'll only talk really about what happens after a forbearance for federally backed mortgages where we know what the rules are. Next slide. The big question is, can you afford your old payment? If you can afford your old payment, the payments you didn't make during the forbearance will be put on the end of your loan as a deferment. If you cannot afford your old payment, then you would either be reviewed for a modification, where they take those payments that you missed and roll them back into the loan and reset the payment terms. If you have an FHA mortgage, there may be the possibility of a modification and deferring some of your payments to the end. But in no case is there loan forgiveness. They're not going to wipe out those missed payments or reduce the total amount that you owe. Next slide. So what is the bottom line? Next slide. If you are struggling to make your mortgage payments, ask your lender for help. Whatever you get, make sure that it is in writing. If you need help asking for a forbearance, you can go to our website, which is posted in the chat. If you are in foreclosure, go to every court date and keep asking for help. The foreclosure judges in Cook County are familiar with CDLS. They may refer you to us. You can also reach out to help through the programs mentioned earlier, CLAD and ERA. Next slide. And these are some resources for tenants, for landlords, and for homeowners that are available to you. You can read them here, but LCBH is more specific for tenants. The Rentervention Virtual Clinic is a website that is a self-help website that can guide you through various questions as a tenant. If you're a homeowner, you can go to our CARES Act mortgage forbearance website. We also have a dedicated hotline where you can leave a voicemail and get a call back from a trained law student. There are new grants that are coming out every day, some for renters. Right now, there are no grants available for homeowners through Illinois or Cook County, but those should be coming in the next few weeks. And then finally, you've heard us mention this hotline before, CLAD, CCLA HD. That is for landlords, tenants, and homeowners. And that is a front door to basically the entire legal aid system in Cook County for housing issues if you've been affected by COVID-19. Next slide.